The transport shuttle's docking clamps engaged with Kepler station with the kind of mechanical precision that marked humanity's attempts to impose familiar efficiency on frontier outposts that served as bridges between civilizations whose approaches to existence operated according to completely different principles. Captain Alex Morgan gathered his assignment files while reviewing linguistic protocols that would govern his interactions with the Altaïran research team, whose cooperation represented one of the few successful examples of peaceful scientific collaboration in an otherwise diplomatically fraught galaxy. Final approach complete, announced Nova, his mission AI, her synthesized voice carrying the careful neutrality that marked all official communications during interspecies assignments. Captain, I should remind you that Altaïran linguistic customs consider improper pronunciation to be indicative of cultural disrespect rather than simple communication errors. Noted, Alex replied, activating holographic displays that showed phonetic guides for basic Altaïran phrases that human diplomats had compiled through decades of often unsuccessful attempts at cross-cultural communication. How critical are the tonal variations for conveying appropriate formal respect? Extremely critical, Nova confirmed, accessing databases that painted a picture of a species whose language carried layers of meaning that exceeded mere information transfer to encompass spiritual and cultural concepts that human linguistic theory had no frameworks for adequately understanding. Altaïran speech patterns incorporate harmonic resonances that indicate the speaker's relationship to the concepts being discussed as well as their respect for the listener's cultural position. The research facility occupied the entire central hub of Kepler station, its crystalline architecture suggesting that Altaïran aesthetic principles had influenced the design to create spaces that served both functional and spiritual purposes according to principles that human engineering had never encountered. When Alex entered the main laboratory complex, he found himself in an environment that seemed to exist partially outside normal spacetime, where scientific equipment operated alongside what appeared to be artistic installations but which his cultural briefings had identified as consciousness-focusing devices that enhanced cognitive capabilities during theoretical research. Captain Morgan, came a voice that carried the musical harmonics characteristic of Altaïran vocal patterns, welcome to the Kepler Research Initiative. He turned to CDR. Zaralyn Valtherin, the facility's chief Altaïran scientist, whose reputation for theoretical brilliance was matched only by her well-documented impatience with humans who failed to demonstrate adequate understanding of her people's cultural protocols. Her appearance embodied the ethereal beauty that marked Altaïran evolutionary development, elongated features that suggested both intelligence and otherworldly grace, skin that seemed to hold inner luminescence despite the artificial lighting, and violet eyes that apparently missed nothing while revealing little about the consciousness behind them. Dr. Valtherin, Alex replied, attempting the formal greeting that his linguistic preparation had identified as appropriate for initial contact with Altaïran scientific authority. I am honored to serve alongside your research team in advancing cooperative understanding between our peoples. His pronunciation of the ceremonial phrase produced exactly the kind of errors that his cultural briefings had warned him about, tonal variations that transformed respectful acknowledgement into something that sounded more like casual dismissal, harmonic patterns that indicated he viewed the research as routine assignment rather than sacred opportunity for consciousness expansion. Dr. Valtherin's response was immediate and musical, laughter that carried the crystalline quality that made Altaïran amusement beautiful even when directed at someone's linguistic incompetence. Around the laboratory, other Altaïran researchers paused in their work to observe the exchange, their expressions mixing professional interest with what appeared to be familiar disappointment at another human's failure to demonstrate adequate cultural preparation. Your effort is noted, Captain Diar. Valtherin said in accented standard, her tone carrying precisely the kind of polite condescension that diplomatic protocols required while making clear her assessment of his attempt. Perhaps we should conduct our interactions in your native language to avoid further miscommunication. What she said next, delivered in rapid Altaïran that she clearly assumed he couldn't understand, revealed her true assessment of his linguistic attempt, another human who thinks learning 3 phrases demonstrates respect for our sacred speech patterns. His pronunciation suggests he views our language as diplomatic tool rather than expression of spiritual truth that connects consciousness to universal principles. Her colleagues' responses, equally delivered in Altaïran assumed to be beyond his comprehension, painted a picture of research staff who had learned to expect such cultural ignorance from human participants. At least this one attempted formal greeting rather than simply assuming standard would suffice. Though his harmonic patterns suggest he has no understanding of the consciousness-matter interface concepts that define our research methodology. Alex maintained careful composure despite understanding every nuance of their assessment, his perfect comprehension hidden behind the facade of linguistic incompetence that allowed him to evaluate the true attitudes of the team he would be working with for the next 6 months. Their comments revealed not just professional skepticism about human scientific capabilities but personal frustration with repeated encounters with humans who claimed to seek cooperation while demonstrating fundamental ignorance of the cultural values that made such cooperation meaningful. "I apologize for my inadequate pronunciation," he said in standard, allowing his voice to carry exactly the kind of embarrassed acknowledgement that would reinforce their assumptions about his linguistic limitations. "I hope my technical contributions will prove more valuable than my communication skills." "Indeed," Dr. Valtherin replied, her harmonics suggesting she was already mentally categorizing him as another competent but culturally insensitive human whose presence would be tolerated rather than welcomed. "Shall we proceed with the facility orientation?" The tour that followed revealed the scope of research being conducted through human-Alterran cooperation. Consciousness-matter interface studies that challenged basic assumptions about the relationship between awareness and physical reality, quantum resonance technologies that operated according to principles human science was only beginning to understand, and theoretical frameworks that suggested the boundary between observer and observed was far more permeable than conventional physics had ever acknowledged. "The primary challenge in our joint research," Dr. Valtherin explained as they moved through laboratories filled with equipment that seemed to blur the line between scientific instrument and artistic expression, "is bridging the gap between human analytical methodology and Alteran consciousness integration approaches to understanding universal principles." "Consciousness integration approaches?" Alex asked, genuinely curious about concepts that his extensive cultural research had identified as central to Alteran scientific methodology. "Your people study reality from the outside, as though consciousness and matter were separate phenomena that interact through observable mechanisms," she replied, her tone carrying the patience of someone explaining complex concepts to someone whose cultural background hadn't prepared them for adequate understanding. "We approach reality from the perspective that consciousness and matter are aspects of the same underlying unity, requiring integration of observer and observed to achieve complete understanding." As they concluded the orientation and Alex was assigned his workspace within the joint research area, he found himself surrounded by colleagues whose assessment of his capabilities would be shaped not just by his technical contributions but by their growing certainty that he represented another example of human cultural incompetence disguised as diplomatic cooperation. Through the laboratory's observation windows, he could see the vast expanse of space that had brought two civilizations together in hope that scientific collaboration might transcend the territorial disputes and cultural misunderstandings that characterized most interspecies contact. His assignment was supposed to demonstrate human commitment to genuine cooperation, but the reality of what he had encountered suggested that success would require far more than technical competence. It would demand cultural understanding that went beyond surface-level diplomatic courtesy to encompass genuine appreciation for principles that human education had never prepared him to recognize or value. The laughter that had greeted his linguistic attempt continued to echo in his memory, musical reminder of how extensive the gap remained between human assumptions about interspecies cooperation and the deeper cultural recognition that would be required to transform tolerance into genuine partnership between civilizations whose approaches to existence operated according to fundamentally different principles. The following weeks established a pattern of linguistic embarrassment that seemed to confirm every assumption the Alteran research team had made about human cultural incompetence. Alex's continued attempts to communicate in their language produced responses that ranged from polite correction to barely suppressed amusement, while his apparent inability to grasp the deeper significance of their speech patterns reinforced their assessment of him as another well-meaning but fundamentally limited human whose presence was tolerated rather than welcomed. The quantum resonance calibration requires precise harmonic alignment, Dr. Valtherin explained during their daily research briefing, her standard carrying the careful precision of someone translating complex concepts into simpler language for the benefit of those whose cultural background hadn't prepared them for adequate understanding. "Your analytical framework focuses on measurable variables, but our methodology requires integration of consciousness variables that your instruments cannot detect. Could you elaborate on consciousness variables? Alex asked, maintaining the tone of professional curiosity that masked his perfect understanding of concepts that his extensive cultural research had already provided detailed knowledge about. The observer's mental state affects quantum field stability at levels that transcend mere measurement error, she replied, then turned to address her Altaïran colleagues in rapid speech that she clearly assumed was beyond his comprehension. He demonstrates the typical human confusion between consciousness and computation. Their minds process reality through mechanical frameworks that cannot accommodate the spiritual dimensions of quantum interaction. Her colleagues' responses, equally delivered in Altaïran assumed to be incomprehensible to human hearing, revealed growing frustration with research partnership that required constant accommodation of human limitations. At least he asks appropriate questions rather than pretending to understand concepts that require lifetimes of meditation to grasp properly. Though his analytical approach suggests he views our consciousness integration methodology as superstition rather than advanced science. Alex nodded thoughtfully at Dr. Valderan's explanation while processing the commentary that revealed how extensively his linguistic disguise was succeeding in concealing not just his comprehension but his genuine appreciation for theoretical frameworks that human academia had never developed adequate models for understanding. "I appreciate your patience with my limited understanding," he said in standard, allowing his tone to carry exactly the kind of humble acknowledgement that would reinforce their assumptions about his intellectual capabilities. "Perhaps you could recommend some basic texts that might help me better comprehend your research methodology." "Basic texts," Dr. Valderan repeated, her harmonics carrying amusement at the suggestion that concepts requiring decades of spiritual development could be learned through academic study. She switched to Altaïran to address her colleagues. "He thinks consciousness integration can be learned from books, like technical specifications for mechanical devices. How typically human to believe that understanding can be acquired rather than developed through experiential wisdom." The response from Dr. Theron Val, her senior research partner, carried gentle mockery that revealed their shared assessment of human intellectual limitations. "Perhaps we should provide him with meditation guides written for children. Though even our youngest students understand that consciousness-matter interface requires spiritual preparation that his people's materialist philosophy makes impossible. I'll prepare some introductory materials," Dr. Valderan said in standard, her tone carrying the kind of patronizing helpfulness that marked interactions between teacher and limited student. "Though I should warn you that our theoretical frameworks require not just intellectual comprehension but spiritual development that your cultural background may not have provided adequate preparation for." "I understand," Alex replied, maintaining careful humility while internally appreciating the irony of being offered remedial instruction in concepts that his years of dedicated study had already mastered at levels that exceeded most human specialists' understanding. The research itself revealed the scope of what human-Altaïran cooperation could accomplish when cultural barriers were transcended, consciousness-responsive technologies that adapted their function based on the operator's mental state, quantum field manipulations that required meditation techniques to achieve proper calibration, and theoretical breakthroughs that emerged from the integration of human analytical precision with Altaïran's spiritual insight. But Alex's apparent linguistic incompetence continued to limit his integration into the theoretical discussions that drove the most advanced research. During critical brainstorming sessions, the Altaïran team would switch to their native language to explore concepts that they assumed would be incomprehensible to human understanding, while his responses in broken Altaïran produced the kind of patient corrections that marked interactions with someone whose cultural preparation was clearly inadequate for full participation. "Your pronunciation is improving," Dr. Valderan observed after another failed attempt at expressing technical concepts in her language, her tone carrying encouragement mixed with realistic assessment of his limitations. "Though the harmonic patterns still suggest you're processing our speech through mechanical translation rather than genuine cultural comprehension." What she said next in Altaïran, delivered with the assumption that he couldn't understand advanced linguistic concepts, revealed her growing concern about the research partnership. His technical contributions are valuable, but his inability to comprehend our consciousness integration methodology limits the theoretical breakthroughs we can achieve through cooperation. How can we explore the deepest levels of quantum consciousness interface when half our team cannot participate in the spiritual dimensions of the research? Her colleague's response carried frustration that spoke to broader concerns about human-Altaïran scientific cooperation. perhaps we should recommend that future joint research initiatives include requirements for genuine cultural preparation rather than simply technical competence. Understanding our methodology requires more than learning vocabulary, it demands recognition of the sacred nature of consciousness itself. Through his hidden comprehension, Alex began to understand that the linguistic barriers separating him from full integration with the research team represented more than communication difficulties, they reflected fundamental differences in how human and Altaïran civilizations approached the relationship between knowledge and wisdom, between technical capability and spiritual development. Dar. Valtheran, he said during one of their evening research sessions, when the laboratory's lighting created intimate atmosphere that seemed to encourage honesty over formal diplomatic courtesy, I sense that my linguistic limitations are creating barriers to the kind of theoretical collaboration that this research requires. Language is never just about communication, she replied, her standard carrying depths of meaning that suggested she was sharing perspectives usually reserved for advanced students of Altaïran philosophy. Our speech patterns carry the spiritual resonances that connect consciousness to universal principles. When humans attempt to use our language without understanding its sacred dimensions, they create dissonance that disrupts the consciousness field interactions necessary for our most advanced research. Alex processed her explanation while maintaining the careful expression of someone struggling to comprehend concepts that exceeded his cultural preparation, though every word confirmed his understanding of how extensively his linguistic disguise was both protecting and limiting his ability to contribute to research that required the kind of cultural integration he had spent years preparing to achieve. The pattern seemed destined to continue indefinitely, competent human technical contributions constrained by apparent cultural limitations that prevented full participation in the consciousness integration methodology that defined Altaïran's scientific advancement. But circumstances were building toward a crisis that would force him to choose between maintaining his protective disguise and revealing capabilities that would transform not just his relationship with the research team but their understanding of what human cultural appreciation could accomplish when motivated by genuine respect rather than diplomatic necessity. The crisis erupted during what should have been a routine calibration of the consciousness-matter interface array, when quantum field fluctuations triggered cascade failures that threatened not just the research project but the structural integrity of the entire station. Emergency protocols activated throughout Kepler station as systems designed to contain exotic matter began exhibiting the kind of instability that could transform scientific equipment into weapons capable of devastating entire space habitats. Containment field integrity dropping below safe parameters, announced the station's emergency AI, its synthesized voice carrying urgency that made every person in the research facility understand they were facing potential catastrophe. All personnel implement evacuation procedures immediately. No, Dr. Valtheran said firmly, her harmonics carrying the kind of absolute certainty that marked someone whose spiritual training had prepared her for exactly such moments of crisis. Evacuation will destabilize the consciousness field matrix that's currently the only thing preventing complete cascade failure. We must restore proper quantum resonance or the containment breach will destroy the station. She began issuing rapid instructions in Altaïran to her research team, technical concepts that required precise understanding of consciousness integration methodology to implement successfully. But the human members of the Joint Research Initiative could only understand fragments of what she was communicating, while standard translation systems proved inadequate for conveying the spiritual dimensions of quantum field manipulation that their crisis response required. Dr. Valtheran, called Dr. Martinez, the senior human researcher, we need those instructions in standard. Our teams can't coordinate response protocols if we can't understand what you're directing. There is no adequate translation, she replied, frustration evident in her harmonics as she struggled to bridge the linguistic gap that was preventing effective crisis coordination. Your language lacks the conceptual frameworks necessary for expressing consciousness-matter interface procedures at the precision levels our situation requires. Alex watched the unfolding disaster with growing understanding that maintaining his linguistic disguise could cost lives, while revealing his fluency would expose not just his comprehension of every disparaging comment that had been made about human cultural limitations but also the extensive preparation that had enabled him to master Altaïran language and philosophy at levels that few humans had ever achieved. The harmonic resonance is shifting toward destructive interference patterns, Dr. Varenval announced in Altaïran, his analysis carrying spiritual concepts that human scientific methodology had no frameworks for processing. We need consciousness field stabilization through integrated meditation protocols that synchronize observer awareness with quantum field oscillations. Dr. Valderan's attempts to explain the required procedures through human interpreters resulted in dangerous miscommunications that made the crisis worse rather than better. The translation systems converted her precise technical instructions into approximations that lost the spiritual dimensions necessary for successful implementation, while her growing frustration with human inability to comprehend critical concepts threatened to turn emergency cooperation into counterproductive conflict. The consciousness integration matrix requires harmonic alignment between all research personnel, she said in increasingly rapid Iran, her stress causing her to abandon attempts at cross-cultural communication in favor of directing her team through methodology that only Iran training had prepared them to understand. Human consciousness operates through mechanical frameworks that create dissonance rather than resonance with quantum field harmonics. Alex realized that the critical moment had arrived when precise communication could mean the difference between successful crisis resolution and catastrophic failure that would destroy everything both species had worked to accomplish through their joint research initiative. His decision came not from calculated risk assessment but from recognition that some situations required choosing between personal safety and collective survival. Dr. Valderan, he said, his voice carrying Iran harmonics that transformed standard words into something that resonated through the consciousness field array with perfect precision, the quantum resonance patterns are reflecting observer anxiety rather than technological malfunction. If we synchronize our meditation practices with the field oscillations, we can restore harmonic stability through integrated consciousness rather than mechanical adjustment. The laboratory fell silent except for the emergency alarms, as both human and Iran researchers processed the implications of what they had just witnessed, not just linguistic competence but deep cultural understanding expressed through harmonic patterns that indicated genuine spiritual comprehension of the theoretical principles underlying their research. Dr. Valderan's expression shifted from crisis management to stunned recognition as she grasped that everything she had assumed about Alex's cultural limitations had been completely incorrect. "You understand consciousness integration methodology," she said in Iran, her harmonics carrying wonder mixed with confusion about how such understanding had been concealed for weeks behind apparent linguistic incompetence. "I understand that observer and observed are aspects of unified reality that require integrated awareness to achieve proper harmonic resonance," Alex replied, his Iran carrying the dialectal variations that marked advanced philosophical training. "The cascade failure is reflecting collective anxiety rather than equipment malfunction. We can restore stability through synchronized meditation that aligns our consciousness with quantum field harmonics." As he began directing the crisis response through perfect Iran that demonstrated not just linguistic fluency but spiritual comprehension of consciousness matter interface principles, the research teams achieved coordination that transcended anything either species had accomplished independently. Human analytical precision guided by Iran consciousness integration methodology created synergistic effects that not only resolved the immediate crisis but advanced their theoretical understanding beyond anything previous cooperation had achieved. "Containment field integrity restored," announced the station AI as quantum resonance patterns stabilized through the combined efforts of researchers whose consciousness field synchronization had transformed potential disaster into breakthrough demonstration of what integrated human Alteran methodology could accomplish. In the aftermath of successful crisis resolution, Dr. Valderan approached Alex with expressions that cycled through emotions her spiritual training hadn't prepared her to process: surprise at discovering capabilities she had never suspected, embarrassment at her previous assessments of his limitations, and growing curiosity about how such profound cultural understanding had been developed and concealed. "Who taught you to speak our language with such perfect comprehension?" she asked, her harmonics barely above whisper level as though speaking too loudly might shatter whatever had made this moment of revelation possible. Alex looked at her with eyes that held depths of preparation and dedication that his apparent linguistic incompetence had been protecting, understanding that his answer would reshape not just their professional relationship but both their civilization's approaches to cultural cooperation that served consciousness development rather than simply political convenience. "No one taught me," he said quietly, his Iran carrying harmonic patterns that suggested he was sharing information usually reserved for the most intimate spiritual relationships. I learned because understanding your people's true nature became more important to me than maintaining comfortable assumptions about the boundaries between our species. The resolution came in the quiet hours after the crisis, when emergency systems had been restored and both research teams were processing the implications of what they had witnessed, not just successful cooperation during technological disaster, but demonstration that human cultural understanding could achieve levels that Altaïran philosophy had never thought possible from species whose evolutionary development had followed such different paths. Dr. Valverin found Alex in the observation lounge where he had retreated to process the consequences of revealing capabilities that would transform his entire relationship with the research team and potentially reshape both civilizations' approaches to interspecies cooperation that transcended surface-level diplomatic courtesy to encompass genuine spiritual recognition. "I need to understand," she said without preamble, settling beside him in the intimate space where stars provided backdrop for conversations that would have been impossible under the formal protocols that had governed their previous interactions. "How did you acquire consciousness integration comprehension that exceeds the preparation of most Altaïran students?" Alex studied her face in the gentle starlight, noting how the aftermath of crisis had stripped away the careful professional barriers that had characterized their relationship since his arrival at the research facility. "How long have you known that my linguistic attempts were deliberately inadequate?" "Since the first week," she admitted, her harmonics carrying embarrassment at having been deceived by someone whose cultural preparation had far exceeded anything she had given him credit for. "Your pronunciation errors were too consistent, too carefully structured to be genuine incompetence. But I couldn't understand why you would choose to appear culturally limited when demonstrating advanced understanding would have earned immediate respect from our research team." "Because I needed to understand what you really thought about human participation in consciousness integration research," Alex replied, his Altaïran now carrying the full harmonic richness that marked someone whose spiritual preparation had achieved genuine depth rather than surface familiarity. "Diplomatic protocols create artificial courtesy that conceals true attitudes. I learned more about Altaïran perspectives on human capabilities through 3 weeks of concealed comprehension than years of formal cultural exchange could have provided." Dr. Valverin processed his explanation while studying his face with the kind of focused attention that suggested she was reassessing everything she thought she knew about human potential for genuine cultural appreciation. "You sacrificed your professional standing and personal dignity to gather intelligence about our true attitudes toward your species. I sacrificed comfortable assumptions about interspecies cooperation to discover whether genuine partnership was possible or whether we were simply maintaining polite fiction that served political convenience rather than consciousness development," Alex corrected, his harmonics carrying depths of meaning that suggested he understood the spiritual implications of what he was describing. "And what did you discover?" she asked, though something in her tone suggested she already knew the answer would challenge fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between species whose evolutionary paths had created such different approaches to understanding reality. "I discovered that Altaïran frustration with human cultural limitations stems not from superiority but from genuine desire for the kind of consciousness integration cooperation that could advance both our civilizations beyond anything either could achieve independently," Alex said, his perfect pronunciation carrying spiritual resonances that indicated he had spent years developing not just linguistic competence but authentic appreciation for the philosophical principles that guided Altaïran. "Scientific methodology." She was quiet for several minutes, her expression cycling through emotions that ranged from professional respect to personal curiosity about motivations that had driven him to undertake cultural preparation that went far beyond anything required for diplomatic cooperation. "Alex," she said, using his given name for the first time since their initial meeting, "the level of consciousness integration understanding you demonstrated during the crisis requires not just academic study but spiritual development that most humans consider incompatible with scientific methodology. How did you achieve such preparation without formal training from Altaïran teachers?" "Through recognition that your people's approach to consciousness-matter interface represents advanced understanding rather than primitive mysticism," he replied, accessing memories of years spent studying Altaïran philosophy through sources that human academic institutions had dismissed as irrelevant to practical scientific cooperation. "I spent 3 years in meditation practices designed to develop the kind of observer awareness integration that your research methodology requires." 3 years, she repeated, her harmonics carrying wonder at dedication that exceeded anything she had ever encountered from human colleagues. You prepared for this assignment by essentially becoming Altaïran in your approach to consciousness development. I prepared by recognizing that genuine cooperation requires understanding that transcends surface-level diplomatic courtesy to encompass appreciation for the spiritual principles that make your scientific advances possible, Alex said, his words carrying certainty that seemed to bridge every gap between their respective evolutionary backgrounds. Dr. Valverin stood and moved to the observation lounge's central viewing area, where starlight created the kind of intimate atmosphere that encouraged honesty over formal protocol. Alex, I need to apologize for the assumptions I made about your cultural preparation and the dismissive comments I made about human intellectual limitations. No apology necessary, he replied, joining her at the viewport where they could observe the vast cosmos that had brought their civilizations together in hope that understanding might prove stronger than the territorial disputes and cultural misunderstandings that characterized most interspecies contact. Your assessments were based on experience with humans whose cultural preparation was genuinely inadequate for consciousness integration cooperation. But you're different, she said, her violet eyes meeting his with intensity that seemed to create direct neural connections between their awareness despite obvious differences in their evolutionary development. You chose to understand our culture at levels that transform cooperation from political necessity into spiritual partnership. I chose to understand because, Alex said, his harmonics now carrying the full depth of meaning that Altaïran communication could convey, what your people have achieved in consciousness-matter interface research represents the next stage of universal understanding that both our civilizations need to reach if we're going to transcend the territorial thinking that keeps us from recognizing our shared potential. When she smiled, her expression created resonance patterns that seemed to transform the atmosphere around them, recognition that transcended professional respect to encompass genuine appreciation for someone whose dedication to cultural understanding had achieved what formal diplomatic protocols had never accomplished. Thank you, she whispered, her words carrying gratitude that encompassed not just immediate recognition but years of wondering whether any human could ever demonstrate the kind of consciousness development that made genuine spiritual partnership possible. Thank you, Alex replied, feeling their connection settling into configurations that would allow them to share research insights while maintaining individual identity that had been enhanced rather than compromised by their mutual recognition, for showing me that cultural barriers exist only when people choose to maintain them rather than doing the work necessary to transcend artificial boundaries between consciousness that shares the same fundamental nature. Through the lounge's transparent walls, they could see stars that had witnessed countless forms of awareness emerge and develop according to principles that transcended species-specific evolutionary pressures, indifferent to the small dramas of individual beings yet somehow complicit in the cosmic forces that brought minds together across impossible distances when they chose understanding over comfortable assumptions about unbridgeable differences. Their partnership would challenge both civilizations' approaches to interspecies cooperation while creating new possibilities for consciousness integration research that served universal principles rather than simply advancing species-specific interests. The laughter that had greeted his initial linguistic attempts had evolved into recognition that authentic cultural appreciation could transcend every boundary except the ones individuals chose to maintain through willful ignorance of the spiritual connections that linked all conscious beings regardless of their evolutionary origins or cultural conditioning. What had begun as deliberate deception had become demonstration that some forms of understanding required patience, dedication, and willingness to sacrifice comfortable assumptions in service to recognition that consciousness itself transcended every artificial category that politics and prejudice had created to divide beings whose fundamental nature was identical despite surface differences that concealed rather than revealed their essential unity.